Welcome to Pod Save the World. I'm Ben Rhodes, and this is the first in a series of special episodes we're doing in the lead up to November's election. We will be asking what the stakes are in a Harris and Trump matchup when it comes to our foreign policy, our national security, and America's role in the world. I hope you'll join us as we look at some of the biggest issues we face globally across the course of 5 episodes. So in the coming weeks, we'll be looking at the issues that we've been talking about a lot on Pod Save the World, and how they're going to impact the election, what the results of the election are going to mean for the rest of the world. The future of the war in Ukraine, the economic and military competition with China, the war in Gaza, and instability across the Middle East, and the most consequential threat of our time, which hasn't gotten a lot of attention in the campaign, climate change. But first, we're going to talk about the battle for global democracy and what the outcome of the election will mean for the future of democracy in this country and around the world. Now, to begin with, it's important to understand that it's not just the United States that is holding an election this year. More people will vote in elections in 2024 than ever before. 64 countries, about half of the world's population. Now, you might think that's good news for democracy, but not all of those elections are exactly free and fair. For instance, Russia had an election earlier this year, and the outcome wasn't really in doubt. And it's not just Russia. A growing share of the world's population lives under some form of authoritarianism. Even within democracies, including ours, we see the rise of the far right. I'm recording this just after a far-right party won the most votes in Austria, a party that was literally founded by Nazis. So this is a pivotal point. Will we remember 2024 as the year the world continues its slide into autocracy and far-right nationalism? Or will we see democracy reassert itself and push back against the world's autocrats? What happens in our election in November will be pivotal. So when it comes to Harris and Trump, how do they view this global democratic backsliding? Well, here's what they've already shown us.
They know Trump won't hold autocrats accountable because he wants to be an autocrat himself. And as president, I will never waver in defense of America's security and ideals, because in the enduring struggle between democracy and tyranny, I know where I stand, and I know where the United States belongs.
When you see President Xi of China, when you see Kim Jong-un of North Korea, when you see Putin, and you see all of these people, they're at the top of their game, whether you like it or not.
In today's episode, you'll hear part of my conversations with Senator Chris Murphy, the Vox reporter Zack Beauchamp, USAID administrator and very good friend of the pod, Samantha Power, and Sarah Margon, the U.S. Foreign Policy Director at the Open Society Foundation. To start us off, I want to play a clip from a conversation we had with Senator Chris Murphy, who very plainly laid out the stakes of what it means if Donald Trump wins another term.
Well, listen, first, our ability to influence friends and allies, adversaries abroad is completely dependent on the health of our own democracy. We have sometimes failed to understand that, but Donald Trump is not kidding around when he says he is going to dispense with democracy and democratic norms, and the threats get more serious by the day. So we, lose our complete moral standing abroad if our democracy is shattered by the election of Donald Trump. But he has also, made no secret of his desire to hand Ukraine to Vladimir Putin. He has shown no desire to walk away from our treaty alliances. He will have none of the moderating voices around him that existed at the very least in those early days. He will, in fact, have folks surrounding him whose views about democracy and America's role in the world are even crazier than his. And so the world that will exist after Trump's election is a world that is fundamentally different than the one we've lived in for the last 70 years. Alliance structures will likely be shattered. The United States will begin entertaining significant, meaningful alliances with dictatorships and autocracies around the world. And whatever moral standing we enjoy today in order to lead a conversation around the world regarding democracy promotion and human rights will immediately vanish. It's a before and after moment for America's role in the world. Trump gave you a preview of what he wanted to do. He wasn't able to implement much of that effectively in his first 4 years, in part because he had people who stopped him from doing it. Those checks are gone in term 2.
Okay, so there you have it from really one of the more thoughtful people in the U.S. Congress. We have a huge choice to make here. Imagine the difference between a Kamala Harris victory and just being done with Trump once and for all, because he's not coming back. He'll have lost 2 elections. He'll probably be going to prison. He's going to be in his 80s the next time around. We won't have solved all of our problems, but it will be an after moment, as Senator Murphy said, if we can just kind of be done with Trump. On the other hand, imagine what it'll feel like if we validate Trump after all that he's done, after January 6th, after all we've learned about his autocratic agenda, all of his cozying up to tyrants over the course of this last decade. If the American people choose that, imagine the message that sends at home and around the world. And this really matters for Americans. This is not like a hypothetical exercise for readers of the Atlantic magazine. We could be facing the specter in a Trump victory of mass deportations in our communities, security forces, ripping people apart from their families in our communities. We could face the further erosion of rights, which we've already seen with abortion rights, extending to other areas. We would likely be facing the weaponization of the justice system. We'd be looking at the United States government being filled with a bunch of right-wing ideologues. I mean, if you really want to know what it'd be like, just kind of look what's happened in other countries where there have been autocratic leaders. We've been talking about these countries, from Russia to Hungary to India. That kind of stuff would be happening here in a Trump victory. And it matters around the world if Trump wins, because as we've talked about a lot, he's part of a trend globally. He's one of a collection of leaders around the world that represent a kind of far-right, nationalist, autocratic politics. His win would be wind in the sails of all of those people. It would be a potential permission structure for all those people to do what they want to do at home and potentially beyond their borders. So that's the bad news if Trump wins. And don't worry, we're going to get to the good news. We're going to get to what Kamala Harris can do if she wins and what it would mean for the world. But to talk about the trend that Trump is a part of, to talk about that trend of far-right autocrats that we see globally and the way they're all connected, we spoke to Vox reporter Zack Beauchamp. Now, Zack has spent years covering this beat, the democracy beat, and he has a new book out that everybody should check out called The Reactionary Spirit. We talked to Zack about what is happening globally, why it matters, and that trend that Trump is a part of. So take a listen.
The analogy that I use in the book is something called convergent evolution, which, there are hedgehogs in North America and there are echidna in Australia, right? No connection at all between these two species, but they both have spines because they face similar environmental pressure, so they ended up evolving in similar ways. The argument that I make in the book is that, that's kind of how we should think about far-right movements, anti-democratic far-right movements around the world today. All of them face similar challenges from egalitarian social movements, from legal systems that militate against hierarchy in one way or another, and all of them have reacted in the same way, which is to claim to be standing for democracy while undermining it in the name of fighting liberalism. But what's happened recently, and I think fairly recently, like we're talking the past decade or so, is that they've developed formal connections, right? Ways in which anti-democratic far-right movements learn from each other and even directly swap ideas or attempt to influence each other. So I'll give you one good example, right? There's something called the Danube Institute in Hungary, which it's not exactly owned by the government, but not explicitly, but it's government funded. And its main job is to distribute the ideas of basically Viktor Orban thought, right, to a Western audience, to try to sell Europe and especially the United States on Orbanism. And they've spent millions of dollars on these efforts, spending just thousands of dollars a pop to bring over a conservative intellectual who's influential in the United States, show them Hungary, convince them that this should be a model for America, where they come home and write about it.
Yeah, I'm one of the few people like you who's in this country that's spent a strange amount of time thinking about the Danube Institute in my own travel to Hungary.
There are dozens of us.
Yeah, there are
dozens of us.
Dozens of us. But I think this in this episode we're looking at the kind of stakes for democracy in 2024 election, and one of the things I keep thinking about is, what does it mean if Trump returns to office? And we can talk about Project 2025 and JD Vance in a minute, but if he returns to office this time around, that ecosystem, even though it's loose as you describe it, it's so much more evolved today than it was in 2016. Like in 2016, I don't think Trump knew who Viktor Orban was when he was elected.
He definitely did not.
Now Viktor Orban is literally going down to Mar-a-Lago after a NATO summit. Now Javier Milei is coming to CPAC, and so is Nayib Bukele from El Salvador, another fellow traveling autocrat. And you've got people who are around Trump, very close to him, like a Steve Bannon or Rick Grenell. They're on the circuit at things like the Danube Institute. To people who might remember the first Trump term and think, oh, it was kind of chaotic, but it wasn't that bad. What does it mean that this brand of far right politics is so much more evolved in 2024 than it was the first time around that Trump got elected?
Well, I mean, here I think the key thing is Trump's domestic plans for capturing the foreign policy apparatus. You mentioned Project 2025 a second ago, but one of the really central things in preventing Trump from becoming the hub of a sort of global far right wheel is that he had a hard time working the levers of policy, not because bureaucrats just disobeyed his orders, but because he literally didn't know what to do and didn't have people around him who would tell him exactly what to do. You saw this a lot on Russia policy in the first Trump term, where Trump would say he wanted to do something and then would never follow up on it. And you would get, Jim Mattis ordering U.S. troops to Poland or something like that to try to show strength towards the Kremlin. Now, though, it's clear that Trump has purged the people who have different approaches to the world from his movement. And he has this capacity, if he wins, to govern in the way that he says he's going to, right? And that means taking a hammer to the series of global institutions that prevent this autocratic alliance from becoming more influential. So that's one thing. Another thing is that it means that there's sort of like a direct pipeline to the White House, right? One thing that is increasingly clear about this movement is it operates in large part through international financial transfers and graft.
Yeah.
And if we know anything about the Trump administration the first time around, it's that it was a vehicle for influence peddling. So it's not just that there's ideological affinity and you'll have people like J.D. Vance who really believe in this international sort of nationalist international vision, right? It's that you will also have a lot of these governments willing to engage in financial practices that convince Trump to work with them as well on direct policy issues of their significance. And the last thing is that you can expect democracy promotion under the Trump administration to basically fall apart. Any kind of pressure on that might be imagined or real from the United States to try to constrain autocratization in a country like India, forget it. That's not going to happen in a second Trump administration.
I want to build on something you just said, which is one of the things I'm worried about is the permission structure that a Trump presidency gives to all these other autocrats, right? And you mentioned dismantling kind of international institutions that are a check and the absence of pressure. I think about everything from the permission structure to a Putin to, do what he's doing in Ukraine and places like Georgia and Moldova, the permission structure to a Modi to kind of continue his transformation of India into a kind of a Hindu nationalist state, permission structure maybe to a right-wing Israeli government to annex the West Bank. I mean, it's always hard to kind of, when you're dealing more in the kind of direction of geopolitical events more than like a U.S. policy that declares that, Putin can invade a country or that the Israelis can annex the West Bank. But how much should we be concerned about what kind of permission slip a Trump victory sends to the world's autocrat that now's the window to do whatever the thing is that you want? And what are the scenarios that you worry about? I named 3 that I'm worried about. What are the scenarios that you worry about with the kind of permission structure of a second Trump presidency?
The country that concerns me the most here is Germany. Not because it's the closest to becoming an autocracy, but because it's so damn important. And AfD, which is the far-right party there, is among European far-right parties. I mean, even this is an exclusive group, right? It is among the most overtly autocratic, the one that would most pose a clearest threat to democracy, if elected, of any of the parties of its ilk in Western Europe. And they're right now the second most popular party in Germany. And so in a second Trump administration, not only will European far-right parties take heart from Trump winning, they'll be like, hey, look, we've got the wind at our backs again, but they'll also face fewer constraints from the US government that might if it's a Harris administration, let's say, that would have to take some serious actions to prevent AfD from destroying the Western alliance from the inside.
I mean, I think you write. I think you write powerfully about your own family's history, right? Your grandfather survived Auschwitz, right? So saw the kind of darkest places that German far right politics can lead. You also talk about the kind of otherization that all these far right leaders engage in. That you kind of identify marginalized groups, or often it's immigrants or people that are different religion. Anti-Semitism enters into that. Islamophobia certainly enters into that in Europe these days. What is it, a Trump election in this country and globally? What do you think it means to what we might call marginalized populations or minority populations who might be otherized in more extreme ways?
The question is, who is the domestic enemy in what country? In each country, what constraints exist on their mistreatment, and how much would mistreatment of particular domestic marginalized groups in the United States have really global ramifications. So I think for the US specifically, the biggest one is obviously undocumented immigrants, right? Trump has been very clear that he wants to conduct a massive deportation effort, right, on a scale that we haven't seen in probably ever, but it reaches back to the horrifically named Operation Wetback in the Eisenhower administration.
Yeah.
I mean, we would really see a kind of enforcement of immigration law that we've never seen in this country, raids that aren't just, based on a tip, but people going around affirmatively looking for undocumented immigrants and trying to find them. And I just don't think that most Americans have come to terms with what the reality of that is, what it would look like, because it seems so outlandish. The idea of having our domestic security forces going around trying to find people to root out of the country, to physically arrest in large numbers, we're talking millions, and somehow get them out. I mean, it involves human rights abuses, not just directed against undocumented immigrants, but people, most likely Latino Americans, who are falsely identified as undocumented, on a scope that really is mind-boggling in an advanced democracy.
Yeah.
One thing that I also think is widely underappreciated in this era where everybody's talking about multipolarity is how much the United States still remains, A, in material terms, the world's most powerful country, and B, in ideological terms, the unquestioned defining power of our era. Everything is either defined for or against the American example, the American-led world order. And so what happens in the US really has these unpredictable knock-on effects in terms of what other leaders believe they can get away with, and in terms of what inspirations people in political movements in different countries take, and sort of how they start thinking about what's possible in their own world.
Okay, so Zack just gave us a pretty dark window into what another Trump presidency could mean and how it connects to this rising autocracy and far-right politics that we see around the world. But there's another side of this story, which is America's capacity to have a positive influence on democratic trends in this country and globally. Now, I should say, we're not perfect by any stretch. It's something we'll talk about in this series, particularly in our episode on Gaza. But I can tell you from talking to Democratic activists and political parties around the world for years now, that they desperately do want the U.S. government to play a more affirmative and effective role in pushing back against autocracy and supporting democratic values. We've gotten this wrong a lot, but we're also capable of getting some things right. We know Trump won't do that at all, right? We know he doesn't even care. And we also know that as Democrats, we have to update our own approaches to meet the current moment. And a lot of the time, for all the discussion of the big geopolitical events, this work of supporting democracy happens through policies and programs that never make the headlines. But they can help seed democratic progress, sometimes in unlikely places. So, we went to friend of the pod, Samantha Power, the current administrator of USAID, to give us insight into what she and her team have been doing behind the scenes during the last 4 years of the Biden administration to promote and foster the health of democracy around the world. Now, those of you who have been listening to this podcast know Samantha and I have been talking about these issues a lot over the course of actually a nearly 20-year friendship. We're getting old. Hope Samantha doesn't listen to that part. The issues have changed over the course of those nearly 2 decades. Increasingly, democracy is not just about elections and support for civil society. Those things are very important. But it's also about whether governments learn the lessons from really the failure of globalization. Can democracies combat corruption and kleptocracy that have been eating away at them? Can democracies deliver in ways that improve people's lives and close the door on autocrats who try to take advantage of cynicism and apathy among electorates? These are the issues that I think have really challenged the community of people around the world that care about democracy, but need to kind of catch up to what's been going on in the world. So in this episode, we continue that conversation that Samantha and I have been having.
Well, first, let me say that the summits that the president has convened, you remember summits, they're a lot of work. You sometimes wonder about the payoff, but I think they can be overlooked in one respect, which is that of narrative. You know, if you think back, if we look back on the trends, which are not good today, so I don't want to sugarcoat anything, but the narrative itself of democracy's decline is something that bad actors actually invest hundreds of millions of dollars to propagate.
Yeah.
Because it is a little bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. You know, when we think about young people around the world, like, do they want to get involved in the fight to protect and preserve their democracy or to get something done in their society? Or do they want to go, you know, launch a startup and make some money and do other things? Like, whether they think there's any hope really matters. So I think President Biden coming out the gate, having these gatherings of democracies, making these countries that are borderline or maybe, you know, slipping, you know, kind of show up with their list of like, here are all the things we're doing. Can we please have an invitation? You know, when countries aren't invited, you know, having to deal with all that, you know, just sort of introduce the idea that this was a club you actually want to be a member of, and then convince people and have them, like we used to do in the Obama administration, have them make commitments that we then follow up at the country level. So that's just in terms of agenda setting, in terms of narrative, in terms of being on offense about why democracy is better. I remember when I was out of government in the Trump years and teaching at the Kennedy School, and I was looking for, you know, really good literature on why democracy was better so I could expose my students to that argument, but with like ballast and numbers and economic data and so forth. And the only thing I could find in that 4 years, so often were we reading about, for example, the PRC's effectiveness in dealing with COVID, or the economic miracle, which is, you know, legitimate in terms of lifting people out of poverty in China. But the thing that I ended up having to go to was a speech that President Obama gave out of government. I think it was in South Africa, maybe, or something.
Yeah, Mandela Day.
You probably had a hand in.
I did.
But I say that not to, you know, compliment our old boss or you, but simply to say people were not on offense on this topic and saying why democracy was better and kind of making the case.
Yeah.
So that's one thing. The second thing I'd say, I think we all in the years some of us were out of government and reflected on kind of what we had missed. We were very alert to just how many people felt left behind in globalization, and very alert to the economic dimension of why autocrats can be appealing, why making the trains run on time, you know, comes to be appealing, or at least how autocrats exploit economic dislocation and grievance. And so for me, that and for President Biden and Vice President Harris, I think that led us to say, okay, so what is the economic dimension of the democracy promotion agenda? What's the flip then of the diagnosis? And that's when I think you and I have talked about this a little bit before we came up with this idea of democracy delivers, that when you actually have a reform opening, which even in the darkness, right, there's always some light, you know, some street protests that have given rise to ushered into power some new woman leader, or, you know, some anti-corruption lawyer, or and that was happening. That happens, you know, in steady state all around the world. And a lot of the places these reformers were coming to power were places that were not center stage in American foreign policy in prior generations, you know, Moldova, Nepal, Armenia, Dominican Republic, you know, and these are all really small countries. But how do we make sure that if we have additional resources or new programs in agriculture and anti-corruption, some new health initiative, given that there's a lot of claimants to those resources and a lot of good that can be done everywhere, what about doing it in a manner that is coupled to the reform agenda?
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. And on these kind of nuts and bolts issues, right, that, we talked about in the Trump years and obviously you've been working on at USAID, I think one of the interesting things was kind of updating the toolkit to focus on things like anti-corruption, to focus on things like, digital literacy or, or use of digital tools for democratic governance. You've launched a democracy, human rights, and governance policy that gets at some of this, but on these nuts and bolts issues of like corruption and digital, are there success stories or programs you can point to that kind of illustrate a new approach?
To your point about corruption, I think this is the first administration, and certainly the first USAID administration that has put corruption at the heart of our democracy and governance agenda, with a particular emphasis on transnational corruption. I think we might have at one point touched on a cool example of a sort of modestly sized tool, but I think symbolically important one, which is corrupt oligarchs have deep pockets by definition. They're corrupt. They're usually good at stealing money. Often they've used that money to not only try to get others to harass or intimidate people who are uncovering what they are doing, but actually to file these frivolous lawsuits, these so-called SLAPP lawsuits. I think you've seen these in the world. And to drive out of business, the Transparency International chapter or the journalists, the relentless journalists who won't give up on uncovering a story just by filing a defamation lawsuit.
Yeah.
So we've created a kind of legal defense fund, knowing that is an increasing a tool that is meant to be a deterrent of the anti-corruption work that the checks and balances need to do. We need something to protect the protectors or to protect the exposers. So I think that's an example of something. And then in that same spirit of what are the checks and balances and how do the autocrats seek to weaken them? In some respects, one of the most important checks and balances doesn't even need the autocrats' help. And that is the natural weakening and rapid weakening of local media and independent media just on dollars and cents grounds, just on market share grounds. And so that's another example of a tool that we've brought online, which is a media viability accelerator, where we sit down with independent journalists, look at the markets, look at the transition to digital if they haven't already gone, look at paywalls, try to figure out, who their targets can be, not only to set them up for the next 6 months, but to put them in a position where they can continue to be kind of watchdogs.
Yeah. And
to try to be quicker than we usually are in rapid response as well. That's the other thing, is having pools of resources where we leave it to the folks on the ground to figure out, okay, is it to shelter somebody who's an LGBTQI plus activist? Is it to provide ad hoc legal defense? Is it actually to do some government to government work with a ministry that's trying to be more cutting edge, to try to render our funds a little more flexible, because we can be pretty tough to maneuver on the fly.
So far you've talked about, democracy delivering, kind of plugging some of these holes that are opened up in the democratic ecosystem, being opportunistic where you see, even small countries that present opportunities. We also know there's this kind of large scale sense of like, where's the momentum, what's happening on the front lines between democracy and autocracy. And so obviously Ukraine has taken this kind of outsized role in terms of kind of shaping how people are looking at this battle between democracy and autocracy, because it's, manifest right there. When you look at Ukraine, in addition just the imperative of, fighting back against a dictatorship trying to, take territory away from democracy, what are you guys doing to try to assure that the Ukraine that survives is a democratic success? That essentially part of the war is, helping Ukraine have an economy that's viable and a society that's viable and a democracy that can over time plug into the institutions like the European Union. How does democracy interact with the Ukraine policy?
One of the coolest things that USAID has been associated with anywhere, I think probably in its history, I'll go out on a limb there, is helping build the Ministry of Digital Transformation in Ukraine. We and the British got involved very early on. And then Ukraine, as you probably know, built this app and this platform called DIA. And DIA is now the ultimate democracy tool, because it is something that when there's a piece of legislation that is floated, I think about 80% of cell phone users have DIA on their phone in Ukraine. A new piece of legislation is proposed. they crowdsource feedback on that legislation from citizens on the fly. When you want to set up a bank account, you can also do that. Get your driver's license, your marriage license. The state in a smartphone idea is being, if not pioneered, it is at its most advanced stage in the country that is suffering, again, a full-fledged horrific conflict. And so when payments are made for a Ukrainian to rebuild their home in this new, in a stopgap way now or after the war, it's really important that that money actually go to its rightful task. Through DIA, the individuals upload photos of their damaged homes. That is processed. The people come and look at the home. They decide how much reconstruction resource is going to be dedicated to that. And then the money comes back to the individual on the phone, ring-fenced, so it can only be used for building materials and supplies in order to do the reconstruction, et cetera, et cetera. So using technology, and now we're taking the DIA app and looking to see, can we bring it to our democracy delivers countries? You know, what would it mean for that app to be active or its features to be active in Armenia as they move in a more progressive direction? What about Zambia, which is bucking the trend and trying to turn its back on a generation of corruption and so forth? So in Ukraine, in addition to everything it's doing for citizens, in addition to it being a model in the fight for democracy and sovereignty and independence, the tools actually being refined there are ones that we think we can take on the road to advance the democracy struggle globally.
That's interesting. So Ukraine becoming kind of an exemplar.
A lab almost.
Well, one last thing I want to ask is just, you can look at the world and see some dark things happening. But you can look at the world and see, Bangladesh, ousting an autocratic leader, the French standing up to the far right, I'll speak for myself. A new Labour government in the UK is exciting, As you look to the election, I know you can't really do that much politics, but what is at stake? I mean, what is the momentum shift based on a Harris victory versus a Trump victory? Do you see some green shoots of progress that could kind of be further galvanized by a certain result in November?
I think on democracy and human rights, it remains, notwithstanding everything that we've discussed in this conversation, it remains the case that our greatest impact as a country is our respect for pluralism, checks and balances. Never thought I'd have to say this, but election results.
Yeah.
Our view that disputes and disagreements should be addressed peacefully and amicably, even if that can be hard. The more heartfelt the disagreement. And so just as important as the toolkit that I've mentioned and continuing to modernize that and to kind of catch up to the tools that the autocrats and the malign actors are using, just as important as all of that is, so too is the model that we send in how we conduct ourselves in elections, in how we welcome more voters coming to the polls rather than, trying to silence them.
Okay, so I think Samantha would be the first to acknowledge that this work is incomplete. We are in a generational struggle for democracy. Kamala Harris is going to have to both build on this progress. She's also going to have to do better than Joe Biden on a range of issues. So what should a Harris administration do to support democracy at home and around the world if she wins in November? She represents the possibility of generational change in this country politically. She also represents the future of multiracial democracy, a future in which identity is something that isn't used to divide us, but has the potential to even bring us together. We can turn the page. But what is the next chapter? To answer that question, I spoke with my friend Sarah Margon. Sarah's worked in the U.S. Congress and at Human Rights Watch. Now she's the U.S. Foreign Policy Director at Open Society Foundations, which works around the globe to promote human rights and defend democracy. I asked Sarah what a Harris administration should do if we get the result that we want in November.
I think there's a tremendous opportunity, and the speech that she gave at the DNC really indicates that a Harris administration would push for partnership. The Biden administration was like, America's back. We're here. And
deal with it.
Right. We're here, and we may be sometimes more harmful than helpful, but we're still back. But the importance of supporting other priorities that are defined by those governments, supporting civil society's needs, impacted communities often, not always, but often know best when it comes to what kind of resolution will make their lives easier, make their lives better. This is a space and a place, I think, where the U.S. can really hit the ground running in a Harris administration. And it's a different approach. It doesn't mean that we abandon America's role in the world or that we pull back from being present, but it's to be a partner, to listen.
Yeah.
You know, for a long time, I've also been thinking about how the world is changing, right, in this competitive, new world that we're in. Instead of just being government to government actors, you're seeing a multiplicity of actors in all of these discussions. Civil society is an alternative center of power. The private sector has a role to play, in many cases, showing up to the table with more power than anybody else. And thinking about how all of this connects and creates a fabric of society in different countries is, to me, extremely important for a new administration. It can't just be, we're going to go, to country X and meet their government and leave. There has to be time for civil society. There has to be time for private sector, both multinational and local corporations. There probably should be time with media and academics. These are all pieces of society that build the fabric of how the U.S. engages going forward.
One of the interesting questions that will be kind of multi-stakeholder sector, as you just described, is she name-checked in the DNC speech artificial intelligence in the foreign policy section, in the national security section.
Yes.
And she also kind of led a task force that dealt with the leading AI companies. It resulted in kind of executive order that begins to think through norms and regulations around the development of AI. But clearly in the next 4 years, all these AI questions are going to go from being somewhat theoretical to being very concrete. Like, what are global norms around AI? How is this going to be regulated? What are companies allowed to know that governments don't know? Describe for people who probably aren't familiar with this, how the kind of democracy and human rights questions are going to interact with what is clearly going to be a focus for the Harris administration. Making sure that America wins the competition on AI, but also that it's safe for us.
Yeah, so I actually think they kicked this off. She kicked this off right. Some of the meetings that they've had over at the White House in the last 6 to 8 months have included the AI companies, but she's also brought in a whole bunch of other stakeholders, including some of the think tanks and organizations that have worked on tech and have done some initial work on AI. This is really important to begin to realize that there is an option for regulation that doesn't stop productivity and doesn't stop positive innovation, but that, and probably, what should have happened decades ago with technology and the internet in the same way, right? This sort of appropriate regulation that allows individuals to engage and be part of something new and exciting, but also does so within a band that keeps you safe. Doesn't mean you're going to lose your job, or doesn't mean that you're going to be overrun by, autonomous robots or weapons, or, killed by them. So I think they've started off with a really good approach, which not only includes a very significantly sized executive order, requires every agency take a look at how to engage with AI, but then they've brought in groups of experts, from companies and private sector folks to outside experts, to advocates. They've also engaged Congress. And I think this is really important to beginning this process, because when you think about what are the human rights conditions that need to be considered, you don't have extremely clear rules of the road, right? When the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was drafted after World War II, this was not part of it.
Yeah.
Technology faces the same challenge, general technology. And so thinking about how do you manage regulation with freedom of speech and freedom of expression? How do you consider the role underage individuals might play? How do you consider recourse and accountability? The use of information? All of those questions come in. It's a little bit of uncharted territory, but I think there's a lot of examples already as the think tank and advocacy community has tried to do a better job of articulating what productive regulation could look like on tech, digital tech. So I think there's some space, but I think if you can get the human rights concerns, the governance concerns in from the beginning, and get everybody to agree on a core set of principles that doesn't stop innovation and production, but ensures safety and security for everybody, that is going to be the beginning of a process that's viable.
I mean, when you look out at the world today, you have a very, relatively high profile conflict in Sudan where the U.S. is pretty engaged, but we've had a conflict in Ethiopia. There's an ongoing civil war in Myanmar, a country like you and I have both worked on a bunch over the years. Where do you see the need for a Harris administration to kind of get more involved? As the U.S. has become so predominantly focused on Ukraine and Gaza, do you feel like there's a conflict or a region that kind of cries out for, some people might say the Sahel, where there have obviously been all these coups. Where do you see a Harris administration needing to focus that part of the kind of values-based paradigm?
This is a really interesting question because it is often that the U.S. is involved in every region of the world, of course, and the U.S. government has lots of different programming and policies. But when it becomes a conflict or the U.S. military gets involved, that's when it sort of gets up the chain, right? Or there's a major humanitarian crisis, as in the case of Sudan. And so I think paying attention and showing up over a period of time in a consistent way, when it isn't about a crisis or it is before a crisis, paying attention to some of the indicators if things are looking a little wobbly, so to speak, particularly in nascent democracies. And sometimes that has to do with protests. It could be attacks on the judiciary, attacks, sort of local elections that are not being run right. It could be restrictions against NGOs and funding for NGOs. There are indications of democratic decline that can often lead to conflict, and better for the U.S. to be engaging fully and robustly from the beginning. But more generally outside of conflict, I would say the part of the world that I'd really like to see the Harris administration engage in using all the tools is the Western Hemisphere. I feel like there's such an extraordinary opportunity to build alliances right now. And we're sort of sitting on the precipice of seeing things remain progressive in Western Hemisphere or move in the wrong direction.
Yeah.
Coupled with the migration trends that, have pretty major political domestic implications here in the U.S., there is such an extraordinary opportunity for the U.S. to engage in its own hemisphere, and to do so, I think, with some alliances. I'm thinking about the incoming president in Mexico, first female president there. I'm thinking about opportunities in Brazil and Chile, and they matter. They matter in a way that I don't feel has gotten enough attention in the current administration. And I think being part of that region would allow the U.S. to also address some of its long-standing challenges in Venezuela and Cuba.
One of the things I've been thinking about is this has been the year of elections. What's the upside for the kind of politics of democracy globally if the end of this year of elections is a Harris win?
Yeah, I love that question. I think it's a reminder, and this has sort of been my consistent theme over the last year, because there's a lot to be worried about and a lot is dark. But I think the bright spot is people. It is not just about a leader, but it is also about the people that surround that leader. It is about the message. It is about the energy. And that, to me, presents an extremely hopeful pathway, because the U.S. election is not only being watched by so many other people around the world, but the ripple effect of the U.S. election, frankly, regardless of who wins, is going to be tremendous. The stakes are really high for global norms, for basic institutions, and for democracy. That's the question, right? Democracy is on the ballot. And I think if you see democracy win here, it will give hope to many of those who are fighting for the same in their own countries.
So there's a lot of work to be done to focus more on those regions of the world like Latin America or Africa, where the Biden administration has been a bit behind the curve, to build partnerships with civil society and even the private sector, to do everything we can to make sure that new technologies like AI don't end up being as harmful to democracy as social media has been, and to be deliberate in trying to build momentum for democratic political parties and movements everywhere. We know that electing Donald Trump would be devastating for democracy. But electing Kamala Harris, it won't solve all of our problems either. I know that firsthand. I was with Barack Obama in 2008 when he was elected, and that was not the end of all the challenges that we faced around democracy in this country or around the world. What it would offer is an enormous opportunity to show the world our better selves, the aspects of America that people around the world still admire, despite all the mistakes we've made, despite all of our flaws, which have been on pretty clear display the last decade. That's a big opportunity that we should not take for granted. So we're going to end today's episode by returning to my conversation with Chris Murphy.
This is a moment of generational change. We shouldn't shy away from the fact that this is going to be a landmark election in which the United States elevates its first woman president. That allows us, right, to show a value set to the world that is pretty extraordinary, right? The world wants to constantly imagine the United States as something bigger than they are. They want us to believe that we are a country that sets the global pace for change. And Kamala Harris, represents the sort of daring ambition of this country, always being willing to change.
So when it comes to democracy, the front line in the world today is, of course, in Ukraine. There's nowhere in the world where there's such a clear line drawn between autocracy and democracy than Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So next week, we'll talk to several people about what the stakes are for the war in Ukraine in this election. That episode will air on Saturday, October 12th on the Pod Save the World feed. We hope you'll check it out.